Touch that wheelchair again, and everyone in this restaurant will know what kind of man you are, Mason Brooks said. The harbor glass in Boston went silent. At the center table, 29-year-old Vivian Marlowe sat in her wheelchair, beautiful, long-haired, graceful, and fighting to stay calm. Across from her stood Daniel Cross, her blind date. Daniel smiled when he arrived, then he saw the chair. Daniel said, "You should have warned me." Vivian said, "Warned you about what?" Daniel laughed loudly. Daniel said that you were coming like this. Humiliation burned in Vivian's throat. She had built Marlowe Medical into a powerful company, but public cruelty still cut deep. Daniel leaned closer. Daniel said, "I thought I was meeting the billionaire CEO, not a sympathy story in a chair." Vivian reached for her handbag. She would not cry. Then Mason Brooks stepped between them. His gray shirt was damp from rain, sleeves rolled, hands still marked with garage grease. Daniel said, "Who are you?" Mason ignored him and looked only at Vivian. Mason said, "Do you want to leave?" Vivian searched his face. No pity, no performance, only respect. Vivian said, "Yes." Mason stepped behind her chair, then stopped. Mason said, "May I?" The question nearly broke her because people usually touched the chair first and apologized later. Vivian nodded. Mason guided her toward the door. Daniel muttered, "Good luck with that." Mason stopped. Mason said, "She does not need luck, she needs better people." Then he opened the door, and the cold Boston night swallowed them. Mason let go of the chair the moment they reached the sidewalk. Mason said, "I'm sorry, I should have asked sooner." Vivian said, "You asked before touching my chair, that matters." Vivian's stomach made a small sound. Mason said, "You did not eat." Vivian said, "I lost my appetite." Mason nodded down the street. Mason said, "Food truck, 2 blocks, no chandeliers, no judgment." Vivian should have said no. But she was tired of rooms where money bought everything except kindness. Vivian said, "Lead the way." Sauce spilled across Vivian's shoe and the footrest of her chair. Vivian froze. She hated moments like that. Not because of the mess, but because people treated her life like a tragedy. Before the apology became painful, Mason crouched with a clean cloth. Mason said, "Hold still. It is just sauce." He wiped her shoe, cleaned the footrest, then gently placed her foot back where it belonged. No hesitation, no awkwardness, no pity, just care. Vivian whispered, "You do that like it is normal." Mason said, "It should be normal to help without making someone small." Under yellow light, Vivian smiled for real. The days after that became ordinary, and ordinary felt miraculous. Mason and Vivian met again by accident, then by choice. They walked along the seaport, heard street music, and shared cinnamon rolls. One evening, she watched him fix an old man's dead car and refuse payment. That night, Vivian opened a sketchbook untouched for 5 years. She drew Mason bent over an engine, focused and steady. When she showed him, he went silent. Mason said, "No one has ever drawn me before." Vivian said, "Then I am glad I was first." A week later, Mason gave her wildflowers with a note inside. It said, "You deserve to be seen as Vivian, not as a chair." Vivian had been admired, photographed, obeyed, and protected. But being seen was new. If you have listened to the story till now, Soul Stories Untold team, thank you from the heart. Just one request, subscribe to our channel for more dramatic and emotional content in the future from us. Let's start again. One Friday night, Mason took Vivian to the rooftop above his apartment. Boston glittered below them. Soft jazz played softly, and they drank hot cider from paper cups. Vivian told him about her mother, who sang while brushing her hair and died 1 year before the accident. She told him she built a loud company because home had become unbearable. Mason did not rush to comfort her. He listened. Then he told her his own story. He had earned an engineering scholarship, but his sister disappeared into addiction, so he left school, took over the garage, and raised his niece Emma. Mason said, "Life does not ask what you wanted. It just hands you someone who needs you." Vivian reached for his hand first. That small movement said everything. A few days later, Mason drove her to an old wooden pier near Cape Cod Bay, where her mother once brought her. Vivian said, "I used to dream of crossing this again." Mason said, "Maybe not the way you imagined, but we can still cross it." He helped her move slowly over the boards. Vivian said, "I do not feel alone right now." Mason said, "You are not." For one perfect moment, she believed him. Then he disappeared. 1 day without a reply became 3, then a week. Vivian sent messages she hated herself for sending. "Are you okay? Please talk to me." Then his answer came. Mason wrote, "I met someone else. You deserve better." Vivian sat alone in the dark and heard her father's old voice. "No man will carry a woman who cannot carry herself." Across the city, Mason sat in his garage, split-lipped and bruised. Two men in expensive coats had waited after closing. "Stay away from Vivian Marlowe." Richard Marlowe, her father, had sent them. Richard treated his daughter's life like a company asset. Mason wanted to tell Vivian the truth, but shame told him he was too poor, too damaged, too far beneath her. So he chose cruel protection. He broke her heart and called it mercy. The rain came hard that night. Vivian left her apartment without a coat, rolling through streets blurred by water and light. She did not plan to go to Mason's garage. Her heart simply knew the way. Near West Broadway, one wheel caught in a crack. She pushed once. Nothing. Headlights swung around the corner, too fast. A horn screamed. Then strong arms pulled her from the chair as the car tore past. She gasped against a soaked gray shirt. "Mason," Vivian whispered, "you left me." Mason said, "I thought I was protecting you." Vivian said, "By lying." Mason said, "Your father sent men to my garage. They told me to stay away. I thought disappearing kept you safe." Vivian said, "I did not need protection from you. I needed the truth. I needed you." Mason said, "I am sorry." Vivian touched his bruised cheek. Vivian said, "Do not decide my life for me again." Then she kissed him in the rain. It was not soft or perfect. It was anger, relief, pain, and love in one breath. The next morning, Vivian brought Mason to the Marlowe estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The mansion looked over the Atlantic like it owned the water. Richard waited in the marble hall, cold and straight-backed. Richard said, "You brought the mechanic." Vivian said, "I brought the man you tried to scare away." Richard said, "He has no place in your life." Vivian said, "He has seen me more clearly than anyone in this house ever has." Richard said, "You are a Marlowe. You carry a legacy." Vivian looked around at the chandeliers and polished emptiness. Vivian said, "I mistook this place for a life because I was too afraid to leave it." Richard said, "Walk out with him and do not expect to come back." Silence filled the hall. Mason leaned close. Mason said, "You do not have to lose everything for me." Vivian looked up at him. Vivian said, "I am not losing everything. I am leaving a prison with a pretty view." And together they left. 3 months later, behind Mason's garage, string lights hung from old brick walls and wildflowers filled glass jars. Emma walked proudly with petals. Vivian wore a simple cream dress, her long hair loose, happier than any magazine cover had captured. Then the music softened. Richard Marlowe stood at the gate. No suit, no security, just an old man in a gray sweater holding regret heavier than pride. He walked to Mason and offered his hand. Richard said, "Love her well. That is all I ask." Mason said, "I already do." Vivian turned away before anyone could see how hard she was crying. Later, Mason wheeled her down to the beach where the Atlantic moved under the moon. Mason knelt before her. Mason said, "Do you trust me?" Vivian said, "Yes." He helped her stand. Her legs trembled, but his arms held firm. For the first time in 5 years, Vivian felt cold sand under her feet. One step, then another, small, unsteady. Hers, Vivian rested her forehead against his. Vivian said, "You caught me when I was falling." Mason said, "And I will be here for every step after." Vivian once thought healing meant becoming who she was before the accident. But standing there in Mason's arms, she understood the truth. Healing was not going back. Healing was becoming someone new. Someone softer, braver, free, and finally seen. She was not broken. She was finally home.